I'm Jodi Rudoren. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Forward, and I'm really, really thrilled to be here with everyone today. Thank you so much for joining us for our Behind the Bylines series. As you know, we're going to be talking about the crisis on campus. Sometimes we call it the chaos on campus or the conflict on campus this spring. And we have a really great group of journalists here to talk with you about it. But Behind the Bylines is a series that we started sometime maybe a year ago. It's exclusive for members like you, and we really do it in gratitude to your support. As you all know, we took down our paywall last fall, right after October 7th. We felt it was incredibly critical that everybody have access to our journalism in that moment. We had actually been planning on taking it down in December. The Forward's been a subscription business for a really long time, but we really believe that as a nonprofit, and as a nonprofit devoted to public service and to using journalism and public discourse and seeing those things as pillars of our democracy, that it's essential that we be free and accessible. And the only way that that works is through a membership program where people like you invest in our journalism and our journalists so that people who don't pay or who don't understand the value of it yet can have access for free. And so we just really do this series of events to thank you for your support, because without your support, none of these journalists and myself would be able to do the work that you appreciate and that we love doing. And also to help connect you to it so that you can share its value with your friends, with your family, with your colleagues, with your neighbors. I just have a couple of sort of housekeeping notes or announcements, and then we're going to get into the conversation. I'm going to introduce my colleagues and we'll get into the conversation. First of all, people always ask us, we will be sending you a recording of this conversation. So don't worry if you miss anything. That email that you'll get with that video will also have links in it to articles that we mentioned tonight. And we would love it if you share that video on your social media feeds or email it to friends and just invite them to get to know us the way you have gotten to know us. The email will also have some other stuff in it. We're going to have a link in it to our new, our annual report. And we're also, I don't know if you didn't see your email this afternoon, Rachel, our CEO, sent out an announcement about some of the awards that we've won recently. Just last night, or Monday night, we collected a record 32 awards, more than any other publication for the third year running from the American Jewish Press Association. And the journalist on screen with me tonight, Arno Rosenfeld, was one of our big winners there for many articles related to anti-Semitism, and his editor on those stories was Lauren Markoe. So you're gonna get to hear more about that later on. So again, just housekeeping wise, I see somebody already put one question in the Q&A, which is great. If you have a question, put it in the Q&A. If you have a comment that you want to just share with everybody, go ahead and share it in the chat, but don't put your questions in the chat because we won't necessarily see them. So as I said, there's nothing that has been more on the minds of American Jews and really the broad American public sphere than what has been unfolding on our campuses this year since October 7th. The Forward was quick to this story. We broke news about some protests and anti-Semitic things happening on campuses at Stanford and other places in the first week after October 7th. And just a few weeks into the war, we sent a dozen reporters out to campuses across the country to what came together under Lauren's leadership, a package called What It's Really Like to Be Jewish on Campus Right Now. And that article was honored by the Religion News Association as the story of the year for 2023. So this spring, we decided to send a bunch of people back to campus. We'd been reporting throughout the year on what was going on. And just as they were heading out, the tent encampment started going up. And so we quickly pivoted from our plans of doing a sort of, deep dive project on all these campuses that would be similar to what we did in the fall to really covering the news as it unfolded And Lauren Markoe, our news editor, was helming that coverage. Lauren has been with the Forward for about 3 years. Before that, she worked in public radio in Washington, and before that at the Religion News Service. And she's been our news editor, as I said, for 3 years. And she was the person who every day was figuring out what you most needed to know about all of the things happening across the campuses across the country, and also really working with this team of 11 reporters who were deployed on these different campuses to make sure that they found distinctive, memorable stories mostly about individual Jewish students or others on campus that helped to really bring this massive unfolding story, help to bring it into our homes and our hearts and give us ways to connect with it. So that's Lauren. On my other side is Arno Rosenfeld, our enterprise reporter and really our lead reporter on covering anti-Semitism writ large. You may know his face and name specifically lately from the new newsletters that he's the host of, Anti-Semitism Notebook. And Arno has really been, as I said, leading our coverage of anti-Semitism broadly and of the debate over Israel on campuses across North America for several years now. He actually he spent a year looking at how the conflict over Israel and anti-Semitism was unfolding at George Washington University, that published in the fall of 2022. So very ahead of the curve. And this spring, Arno was on campuses including Duke, Elon University, and UNC. He's also been back to George Washington a number of times. He's reported on CUNY, and he's really one of the world's experts on this issue. So I'm grateful to have him with us here. And a surprise to you from the marketing of this, is Rebecca Massell, who is our brand new summer intern. Rebecca is a rising junior at Columbia, and she started as an intern on our news desk Monday or yesterday, Monday. But I roped her into coming today because she has a very firsthand experience covering these protests and not just covering, but living what it has been like to be a Jewish student and student journalist on campus this year. In addition to being one of the main reporters around the conflict and the campus protests for the Columbia Daily Spectator, Rebecca also has helped a number of national journalists, including Frank Foer, who wrote the piece in The Atlantic a few months ago about what was going on in campuses, among other things, and also authored her own piece in the national press in Rolling Stone about anti-Semitism on campus long before the last chapter of the eruption of student protests. That was a lot of intro by me, and so I'm gonna start by asking each of you, and maybe we'll go Arno, Lauren, and then Rebecca. I'd love to hear you kind of situate us a little bit by starting by telling us, what is something that you saw happening either firsthand on a campus you were visiting or as you read into the coverage that really surprised you about the last 6 weeks, or the 6 weeks of how this campus protest movement this spring rose up, and then the crackdowns on it, and the way the twists and turns have sort of carried us through commencement. So just tell us about one specific thing that really surprised you and maybe went against what you felt like was the prevailing narrative.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jodi, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I guess I don't know, the prevailing narrative piece is a little bit different, but I would say what surprised me the most, I think, was the police response to the protests. Because I think I mostly did journalism when I was in college, but my last sort of half semester, I quit the newspaper and I went to work for the student government doing some activism around, they were trying to quadruple international student tuition. I was an international student. I went to school in Canada. So, I also dabbled in student activism and, have covered it for years. And I think for a long time, there was a sense that, campus is a little bit of a sandbox or a playground, and you can do things on campus that you could not do off campus. Even though people are legal adults, I think there's an acknowledgement and understanding that people are feeling out their politics, their activism, tactics, and, you might be subject, you might get suspended, you might get fined, But there's a longer leash. And I was really surprised that it seemed like that disappeared very quickly with the encampments. Brandeis University was the first school to arrest students back in November. But then it was really quiet for a long time. And it wasn't until Columbia really led the way with bringing police to clear out the encampments. And I think for a variety of reasons, the fact that Columbia is, has a sort of illustrious reputation, it's an Ivy League school, that gave sort of tacit permission for other schools to do that. And at the same time, this got really wrapped up in, especially in more conservative states. I was reporting from North Carolina, where, the president of the school, who was a conservative appointee, made this big show, bringing in the police to clear out the encampment, which had been, when I was there, very peaceful, clearing them out. And then he marched in with the American flag and hoisted it in the middle of the square. And I think the total tally now is well over 2,000 students and faculty arrested, sometimes quite violently. So that was something that, it got a fair amount of attention, but I was just surprised at that. And I'm curious what the long-term impact of that will be.
Yeah, I know. I remember when the Columbia first round of arrests happened, and they were for trespassing, and we were all sort of like, like some of these students live in the place they were just arrested for trespassing. Like that's going to be an interesting legal argument. I will say I think it was a week later when some of those same students, after resetting their encampment, broke into Hamilton Hall and held the janitorial staff, like, sort of hostage. I felt like that was equally surprising in the other direction. But Lauren, what about you? What did your reporters bring back that really made you go, huh?
I was surprised how many of them came back with stories and quotes and interviews from Jewish students who really didn't feel they had a place to go within the campus chaos. They felt lonely and unheard. And these were not the students who felt comfortable wrapping themselves in an Israeli flag and going to a counter protest. And these were not the Jewish students who were in the encampments. I am guessing it is most Jewish students who feel somewhere in between and didn't feel comfortable in either place, did not feel comfortable speaking out in class. They did not like the way that sometimes Jews, always Israel was talked about on campus. But at the same time, they didn't feel comfortable with everything Israel was doing. And those students seemed incredibly lonely to me. And I think some of our best stories from the past month captured that.
Rebecca, for you, I feel like a lot of us were, quite surprised that the encampments happened. And then, of course, as Arno articulated, at the intensity of the crackdown and the arrests. But from a student perspective, and from someone who'd been really both, again, living and studying this kind of the whole year as your beat, I wonder if you were surprised at all by the encampments happening, and maybe start there, but then also share whatever it was that you found most surprising.
So first of all, thank you for having me. I think at first, the encampment itself, I wasn't so surprised by. The Spectator has been really following the story, and I've been following it since October 7th, since day one, and you could really see it build. But I would agree with Arno. When the police came, I was at the front of that line watching the arrests, like between the protesters outside of a lot of people were watching, but I was in the front row watching the police. And it was surprising to see them. I knew they were coming a few minutes beforehand, but it was very surprising because it wasn't so much in line with what the university seemed to have been putting out up until that point. So until then, there were suspensions, there were threats of expulsion, unclear. It was very unclear what was happening, but what was clear is that the university kept saying they were going to punish students, and the protest movement continued and grew and grew. And so all of a sudden, looking back, hindsight's 2020, it makes sense that the day after the president was grilled in Congress, that was then authorized, but that was surprising in the moment.
Rebecca, tell us more about being in the front row at that moment and the police, like, what did it feel like? What did you see? What did you hear?
Sure. So I came because I was part of the reporting team on that. We kind of knew that something was going to happen, and the university had made it clear all classes were canceled, not by the university, but by different professors as it continued. There were, I would say, thousands of people circling the encampment a few weeks before there was the eclipse, and it was almost like the same amount of people on campus. And then in the middle of campus were the students, I believe it was 108 students who were arrested in that initial arrest, sitting in a circle, and they were singing. And the police came and arrested them one at a time. But students, I think for Jewish students, and based on interviews I had in the moment and right after, for a lot of students, it was very upsetting. Even if they, whether or not they agreed with that, they were very upset to see the police on campus. And then there were Jewish students who felt almost relieved by the administrative response, because to them, they've been raising concerns for months and they felt like finally they were being listened to. So there was those two sides within the Jewish community.
Lauren, I wonder, Lauren, I think some of you may know, Lauren is the parent of a high school senior, and actually a recent high school graduate who's on her way to NYU.
Almost,
And
almost.
almost graduate, sorry. She went to the prom. And I'm interested in what you think. One of our most important value propositions here at the Forward, right, is to provide clear, fair, independent information that will help kind of illuminate the complexities of situations like the crisis on campus, and help people see kind of all of the different perspectives of the university and the police and the protesters and the counter protesters and the people who feel left out and lonely. And I feel like with this story, I mean, with the whole post-October 7th story, but particularly also with the campus story, I feel like we've been doing that in some ways, pedaling uphill against a lot of forces who are manipulating the story, distorting the story, putting out information that is a really agenda driven and confusing. And that includes people posting on social media distorted images of what's going on or why. And it also includes, I think, a lot of organizations, activist organizations in the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community who are really distributing narratives that are spun up. And I'm interested in like taking your, work life where you're really focused on this kind of complexity and nuance, whatever, and your Jewish life where you talk, or not Jewish and non-Jewish, where you talk to people who are consumers of this information. Like, what do you think people most have misunderstood about what happened on campus, or what kinds of things are you hearing that feel really wrong to you, and that you find yourself being like, well, this is not really how it is, or did you see this other thing?
I think the most I hear is panic. And I don't think the panic is necessary. And I have had other parents come to me and say, how are you going to limit the list that you allow your kid to apply to? And I say, I'm not. That said, in different circles, I think families would have different concerns that their kids were going to be indoctrinated by the pro-Israeli side. I think it depends on where you are. So my stock line was, my kid gets to apply wherever she wants to apply. And when she has questions, she can ask. I'm her mother. She's been raised to be skeptical. Plus, she's a student journalist, so she's got those values inculcated. But the wrongheadedness I see when I've had to say, "Hey, wait," is people who are getting emails every day, action alerts, send money here, because students are unsafe on campus. Actual incidents of violence, extremely rare, extremely rare. That said, I am sympathetic to those who say, oh, it's okay just to be uncomfortable. I think sometimes incidents have gone beyond discomfort and wouldn't be tolerated if other groups were targeted. So I am also sensitive to that as well.
And what about you, Arno? What kinds of distorted understandings are you hearing about? And maybe also you can go from there into like what you think is going on in terms of how much are people just really scared and say talking about their fears versus people with agendas trying to make people think something that's not true.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, and one statistic that I always like to lead with, the good news is there's been a ton of polling about this. It hasn't all been good polling, but very consistently, the level of concern about anti-Semitism on campus by older American Jews is phenomenally higher than that from younger American Jews. Something like, one poll that came out in the fall when there was the first wave of this, 35 and over, 80% said that anti-Semitism was very serious and that it was more severe than racism or homophobia or Islamophobia. Under 35, which would include 18 to 35, it was something like 40%. So half the rate said anti-Semitism was a serious problem on campus, but that 40% said that it was an equal problem, equal or less severe than racism, Islamophobia, homophobia. So that suggests that people are misunderstanding the situation, right? It is illogical that the students who were ostensibly the victims of this harassment and are young and have friends who are, I'm 29, so I still have people who are close to recently out of school, would be less concerned about it than people who are detached from it. I don't think that all comes from bad faith. I think it becomes an abstraction, right? And you see one story, you see a story about what happened at Stanford, and you go, oh my gosh, it must be horrible to be Jewish at Stanford right now. Whereas when you're a Jewish student at Stanford, you're mostly going about your life, and then you may have whatever sort of reaction you have based on your politics and your identity to incidents that take place. So I think that part is natural. And then you also have a sort of concerted political effort. And again, I don't want to say good faith or bad faith. I'll leave that to other people, but this has gotten caught up. For example, we have Republican members of Congress who have used anti-Semitism and these protests against Israel as a kind of cudgel that they have wrapped into a larger set of grievances about, liberal higher education, which we saw prior to all of this in Florida with Ron DeSantis sort of doing the state takeover of some schools, and that we've seen around the country at the K through 12 level. So it's gotten wrapped into this broader political fight. And I think there are a lot of American Jews who are not at all sympathetic to that. They're not worried that, diversity training is anti-Semitic and a threat to Western liberal order or whatever these folks who are concerned about, critical race theory suggest. American Jews who are pretty liberal on those issues, but they have sort of been pulled into this movement due to the fears around anti-Semitism. So I think that's a big part of what I'm seeing. And then Lauren's right. There's the Anti-Defamation League launched a daily newsletter about campus anti-Semitism. And still, even though many schools have graduated and are over for the year, every day I get an email with like 20 things, 20 one-line bullet points of anti-Semitism on campus. So there's a lot of alarmism. And if you're concerned about it for a legitimate reason, right, to begin with, there's a lot of fuel to keep you agitated and afraid and not necessarily in touch with the experience of Jewish students who, I think to Lauren's point, a lot feel homeless, which is sort of shocking if you think about the level of resources on campus for Jewish students, especially at larger schools. There are a lot of Jewish organizations working on college campuses and a lot of funding. And so the fact that you have a huge segment of Jewish students who don't feel like they have a home, that to me is kind of startling.
Rebecca, I should
say
that the alarm has made it all the way to Israel. And if you talk to Israelis, they're terrified for us.
They just want to know what's going on campus. It's totally right. Rebecca, how does the statistic that Arno cited ring to you? Does that reflect your and your roommates and peers experience that the olds are much more freaked out about this than the actual students?
I think yes and no, like most things. Right after October 7th, so on October 11th, an Israeli student was assaulted at Columbia. I broke the news, reported it, and then over the course of the next few days, I interviewed 54 students, 33 out of 54 said they felt unsafe on campus, whatever that meant to them. And obviously, part of that is for sure correlated. There was the first large protest on October 12th. So, like, it didn't come out of nowhere. And while I do think that, and I often hear questions about physical safety walking to class, and I don't think that is the number one issue at all times. There were certainly moments where I interviewed students, I saw Jewish students being harassed while walking to class, harassed while wearing a yarmulke, feeling very uncomfortable in class, feeling very uncomfortable in student groups or clubs where they needed to kind of defend their Judaism and explain that while they're Jewish and they might be a Zionist, that doesn't mean what you might have thought. So I do think that it's hard to tell somebody, oh, you're physically safe statistics wise, and probably you're physically safe on campus, and so you should feel welcome and you should feel safe. Because I think being safe and feeling safe are very different.
Let's get into that, because Lauren alluded to it a little bit before. She mentioned, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. It seems to me that a lot of people I hear talking about whether students are safe are actually really talking about whether they're comfortable. And I think long before we were talking about Jewish students' comfort and safety, there was a lot of discussion about students of color feeling safe or comfortable on campus. There was conversations about first-gen students or poorer students or students from schools that weren't as rigorous as other schools feeling comfortable and safe. And I remember from my own time in college all those years ago and decades ago, but also from a slightly earlier chapter at Columbia, there was a lot of focus on sexual violence, sexual assaults, and on the idea of women feeling unsafe because of the way that sexual assault or harassment cases were handled by the university. So I feel like this language of safety has evolved over decades at college campuses. And I wonder how you think, I mean, we can start with you, Rebecca, and then others can jump in, but like it does, I am concerned that people are conflating safety and comfort and wanting to create campuses where everybody's comfortable, which in itself will be suppressive of like diversity of thought, because like I think of college as a place where people are going to be uncomfortable all the time because you're constantly like confronted with new ideas and different people, and like you have like being uncomfortable is a good way of learning and of learning also to like integrate. So I wonder, this now I'm on my soapbox about comfort and safety, which is a big issue for me, but what do you think, Rebecca? And then we'll go around the horn.
So a lot of people I interviewed kind of talked about that, and a lot of them said that they would love to feel uncomfortable. They would love to have challenging conversations about Israel and the war and the Israel-Palestine conflict and all of these different things. But I do think it's hard to tell somebody, like, that's very different than when there are large protests outside of Columbia's gates. So New Yorkers are protesting and a Jewish student removes their yarmulke because they feel unsure of what's going to happen on their walk from, let's say, the Hillel building, which is down the block, to their class. And so that question, maybe there's not so much evidence of people being assaulted that week. And luckily at Columbia, there hasn't been many physical acts. There have been some, but not many acts of physical violence. But it's hard to then turn to that student in an interview who's telling you they feel unsafe and saying, well, you don't really feel unsafe, you feel uncomfortable.
Right. How about you? Did you feel unsafe? You have your Hebrew name necklace that you wear. Did you feel unsafe ever?
So on campus, I didn't often wear it just for different reasons. I also, like, while I'm reporting, I think it makes more sense to, even though I don't think a Hebrew necklace is a political issue in any way, would never want it to seem that way.
Just for independent purposes, so that you're not perceived. You don't want to be perceived as anything or have people make assumptions about you while you're reporting, right? Keep the focus on them.
Yeah, exactly. I do think there were moments where I felt physically unsafe. I once I published this story about the Israeli student being assaulted, there was a lot of backlash and threatening emails. So then I left campus and contacted public safety, and I felt unsafe. Like, I didn't know if somebody had my address in that moment, like my dorm address. There were other times where I didn't want to walk on campus alone or to campus alone because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And I don't think that's very different to me than feeling uncomfortable in a class discussion, which I think the line between those things are often blurred.
Yeah. And I think we had a story in this morning's newsletter, Forwarding the News, which I hope you all are subscribed to, that Columbia is now starting in the fall some kind of Jewish walking service, right? For people who feel unsafe, they can get someone to accompany them. We had that when I was in school as well. Arno, how do you think this particular language around safety is playing out in this debate, and what is it connected to? I feel like there's always these particular buzzwords that arise with controversial debates or topics, and I feel like safety and unsafe is one of them, and you see it in all. One of the things Arno's done brilliantly is track the lawsuits that various groups are filing against universities around anti-Semitism, and they all focus on this idea of safety, right?
Yeah, it's a good point, and I think, you know, one thing that Rebecca said, and one thing that's been really true, and it's challenging because my favorite thing always is, of course, to talk to students and ask students what they're experiencing, to Rebecca's point, right? That you don't want other people to be speaking on their behalf, and it can be very campus dependent. So both Columbia and CUNY, City University of New York, have sort of porous campuses, CUNY much more than Columbia, but there's an element to which they are integrated into the city. And so you have people who are not necessarily part of the campus community who students are subjected to. And there has been, I mean, look, it's, you know, I'm always looking for areas where the Jewish community is somehow defying the national trend, right? Something is happening in the Jewish community that isn't happening to everyone else. It's very rare to find. And so what are we seeing in the country right now? We're seeing higher levels of sort of vitriol than we've ever seen before, hyperpolarization. You know, we saw January 6th. And so, of course, that trickles down to the campus level. And so you have protests that are, you know, if not violent in the you know, January 6th sense of the word, or students physically attacking each other, are very vitriolic, right? There's a lot of hatred and dehumanization on both sides, and that has spilled over into violence. And I've heard from, you know, I've heard the stories that Rebecca is talking about Jewish students being physically harassed or hounded either by students or off campus. And I've also heard Jewish students who were part of the protest that have described being hounded by other Jewish students off campus as, you know, traitors or whatever. And I think there was also an incident where somebody pepper sprayed or sprayed something on the protesters. So, you know, again, these aren't the most violent things in the world, but they are physical. And there have been other schools where, either by luck or by very intentional decisions, my colleague Mira wrote a great piece from Brown where the protest leaders had specifically taken steps to try to diffuse some of the polarization. So they had people set up to talk to passersby about their feelings and about the message of the protests. And, you know, I was at other schools where they had set up, you know, people to stand around the edges of the protest and try to diffuse conflict. So I think it varies a lot from school to school. One of the tragedies of anti-Semitism becoming politicized in the way that it has is that people often think that the debate begins and ends with whether something is anti-Semitic. So if we prove that you have been anti-Semitic, then we win and you lose. But if you can defend yourself and say we're not anti-Semitic, then you win, and you don't have to worry about whether you are making students uncomfortable. And I take all of your points, Jodi, about, you know, the importance of discomfort, but I also think that it is legitimate to be concerned about discomfort, especially when that discomfort is not about pushing people to engage with difficult ideas, but when it's about demonizing and writing off your fellow students. And I think there's an element at these protests where many of the protesters have convinced themselves, I think with a lot of validity, that they are not being overtly anti-Semitic, or they're not being anti-Semitic at all, right? It's a political debate. They have political views. They might be Jewish, or they have Jewish friends in the protests who support exactly what they're doing. So they look at it and they say, this isn't anti-Semitic. And it ends there, even when they are comfortable telling a student, you know, say a Jewish student, one of the students that Lauren was talking about, who feel caught between these things, you know, but who isn't ready to completely disown Israel, or who is a little alarmed that they aren't, you know, that the protesters aren't condemning Hamas, say, you know, telling that person that they're, you know, a genocidal baby killer, that's really toxic for campus discourse. And I think it's often hard to get the protesters to pause and say, oh, this is too far. I shouldn't be doing this, because they're convinced that they're going to be accused of anti-Semitism no matter what. So what does it matter if they take the more extreme or the less extreme view? Their billboard, you know, their faces are being put on billboards that are driving around campus. They're being, you know, doxxed online. And I think a lot of that is coming from off-campus actors. So it would be interesting. Of course, it's a counterfactual that will never come to pass, but it would be interesting if we could see what happened if it was just the students on campus who were working this out among themselves. But yeah, I would say it's definitely mostly in the realm of discomfort, but I don't want to dismiss that discomfort as
I
a
hear
realm.
that.
Arno,
There's
if
a
I could
question.
pull on a thread there, if I could pull on a thread that Arno
go ahead.
brought up about how it goes beyond discomfort. One of the elements of the protests that I think was most upsetting to many of the Jewish students we interviewed was the fact that many of the protesters would not engage with them, would not talk about them. So
Right.
when we talk about, you know, discomfort is good. Part of the reason you go to college is to have these heated discussions. If the protesters will not talk to you or will not engage or say, or literally say, if you are a Zionist, you should not stand on this portion of campus, that seems to go on. Maybe you're not physically unsafe at that point. You're probably fine. Your physical safety is good. But, you know, there's a psychological toll that takes
Yeah.
that many people say we would not tolerate if we were talking about students of color, queer students.
Or students who thought a certain thing about another political issue.
Yeah.
And I want to bring that back to Rebecca, because she was saying something to me in the office earlier today about that almost that exact thing, because we did see many examples of encampments where they said, you know, no Zionists inside, no X inside, and some Jews felt that they were targeted by that. And I know you were telling me, Rebecca, that even before the encampment started, this sort of litmus test on campus had become a real thing, that you were seeing it play out where people were asked, it had become a barrier to entry, where people were really limiting, you can be in this space if you are X or Y, right? So can you illuminate that a little bit more for us?
Definitely. So I think back in February or March, I published a story in The Spectator, where I had done a lot of research about Jewish students who, kind of like Lauren was saying, aren't necessarily at the forefront of the pro-Israel movement. And most of them would consider themselves Zionists. Most of them would say that they certainly believe Israel has a right to exist. Some spent a gap year in Israel, and a lot of them felt like they came to Columbia, which was the school I was writing about, but I think it applies to many schools, to learn and to be part of the broader outside of Hillel and Chabad. And all of a sudden, they were either explicitly or implicitly kicked out of those spaces. And so a lot of them mentioned instances, and something that stood out to me in these interviews, actually much more than students who had been harassed, was the pain and like the feeling of extreme rejection from roommates, from friends, like real friends that people had had for years, that all of a sudden on October 9th wouldn't speak to them. From clubs that they spent years becoming leaders in, a dance club, a domestic policy organization, another student told me about. And then either those clubs signed on to the larger pro-Palestinian coalition at Columbia, which to those students, they felt like that coalition was too far and they weren't comfortable either being part of that, or they raised concerns and those concerns were shut down. And so a lot of them left those clubs, or were faced with this choice of, should I stay on principle? Should I leave on principle? What should I do? But now it's not what I want to do. Do I want to dance or not? My principles about Judaism and Zionism.
I mean, it's interesting because, Arno, I feel like back in 2021, 2022, you wrote a number of stories about this kind of litmus test, and it was almost always like, when that was found to be happening, it was like immediately condemned and perceived as like not okay. There was a particular controversy over that voting rights rally in Washington where some
Yeah.
groups were excluded because of Zionism, and it was reversed immediately. And it now does feel like, particularly on campuses, but maybe in other spaces too, this has really become acceptable. You can't be part of this if you are X.
No, I mean, to put a finer point on it, the litmus test was never viewed as the problem. The problem was a litmus test only applied to Jews. And so the coalition that you're talking about, there was a coalition in Washington, D.C. about voting rights, and a group, an environmental group, actually announced that they were boycotting the coalition because three Jewish organizations, they didn't like their politics on Israel. And people pointed out that there were a bunch of other organizations in that 100-organization coalition that had the same positions on Israel, like the teachers union owned Israel bonds, for example. But the idea was like, you can't only make Jews answer these questions around Israel. You're of course allowed. I mean, every coalition
Do you think that would, do you think that would
test.
play out the same way now? Because it feels to me like that
Yes,
kind
yes.
of thing is now happening much more regularly on campuses and off campus.
No, I mean, look, the challenges, and this is what I was going to say, is yes, I do think that it would play out the same way now. The question, though, is if you fix that problem, and if you say, well, we aren't going to single out the Jews for this litmus test, we're going to apply the litmus test to everyone, you're still left with the fact that it is almost only relevant to Jews. And so you could say, okay, well, we're going to screen everyone, and we're still going to kick out those three Jewish groups. So what do you do with that? And I think the challenges, and this actually connects to something else that I've been working on, which is about this phenomenon of Jewish foundations that after, family foundations that after October 7th found themselves in the position, they realized that they were funding organizations that had either, if not celebrated October 7th, hadn't condemned it or had signed on to things that these organizations found to be offensive around Israel. And so now they're looking at like, well, can we keep funding these progressive groups? And the reason this comes up for Jews so much is that the other political issues, we want to try to apply this to something else. Take abortion, for example. The thing is, you don't have progressive students at college campuses or progressive foundations for that matter, or progressive organizations that are like adamantly pro-life, where it's a live issue that needs to be, because if you are opposed to abortion rights, you're on the conservative side of the coalition. Or if you're opposed to gay marriage, you're not trying to join a progressive campus club. And Jews are in this very unique position of being very liberal and very progressive on almost everything. And at home in these left-wing spaces, which a lot of college campus is a left-wing space, but for Israel. And for many years, there was this complaint by pro-Palestinian activists, PEP, progressive except for Palestine. And there was this idea that enough of that, and again, just to ground it, I mean, we're all talking about campus anti-Semitism, but of course, what the protesters say is, in their view, right, there's a genocide taking place in Gaza. And if not that, 30,000 plus dead, many of them civilians. They're looking at horrific images out of Gaza. And they're sort of like, if you can't condemn that, I don't want you in my coalition. Of course, it's much more complicated than that for many Jewish students, but that's where they're coming from. So I think it only comes up, though, because you have so many Jews that want to be in the progressive space. They're just stuck on Israel.
Great. I want to go to one of the questions that from the audience, someone named Ed Whiteman. Thank you, Ed, for supporting us. He says, it seems that faculty are perhaps a bigger part of the problem than just the students. Can you speak to the faculty issues? I'm going to ask Lauren to start us on this. I think Ed is probably talking about a couple of different things, or I'll refine the question myself, which is, I mean, one big question is the level of sort of anti-Israel sentiment among faculty who teach all different kinds of subjects and perhaps bring into the classroom a sort of bias. I guess the second question I would have is the role that faculty played or didn't play in either. We saw some faculty on campuses protecting protesters. We saw faculty, some Jewish faculty, signing open letters that, supported or didn't support the administration or the students. I wonder what what your sense was. We also published an inordinate number of very, very smart essays from faculty perspectives that I thought were very good in the opinion section. Although I would say overall, it felt to me like there was a general dearth of sort of leadership from university administrators and in some ways from faculty as well. But Lauren, what's your sense of the role that faculty played throughout the year and particularly this spring in terms of the protests?
So we saw faculty most prominently on many universities locking arms. We're protecting our students in the encampments. Among those faculty were some Jews, for sure. And you're right, Jodi, there were faculty members who protected Jews. I think most famous among them is the Berkeley professor who slept in his office for days and days and days, and it became a gathering spot for Jews at the University of California at Berkeley. So we've seen faculty on both sides of the issue, Jews and non-Jews, and the letters, I mean, that's what faculty do. They write, and they wrote letters, so many we could not keep track of them on both sides. I think the faculty are secondary to the students. I think many people would like to think that the faculty are driving the protests, or that they are brainwashing kids, or it's only because these kids have been sitting in these classrooms absorbing what faculty members have told them that they feel this way. I think no matter how you feel about the protests, you've got to give students some credit. There are high school students and even younger kids who have strong feelings about what they are seeing on their phones, and it's their phones. It's not where we older people get our news. So I think it would be wrong to say, oh, if we just had better policies about hiring and the universities weren't so woke, that we wouldn't be seeing so much of this. I'm not sure if that's what the questioner is getting at. We also see a little bit of a countervailing trend right now. MIT, a couple of weeks ago, Harvard last week, rescinded a policy that required certain job applicants, staff members, to sign a DEI statement. And they are now backpedaling on that was too much of a litmus test for faculty to say they support DUI, which in many cases Jews say is discriminatory against Jews because it supports diversity except Jews. So we're seeing that as well. The faculty are an element in these protests, but don't take too much away from the students here. They are leading this as they always have in protest.
What's your sense, Rebecca, of the role that faculty played in either fomenting or diffusing tensions on campus overall?
So I think there are possibly three different, maybe two different, but three different categories of faculty. So some of them are at Columbia, let's say, one of the leading institutions in Middle Eastern studies. And there are many pro-Palestinian, openly pro-Palestinian faculty members who are very, like, this is their expertise. And so a lot of them came out after October 7th with their views, some more pro-Palestinian than others, pro-Hamas than others, etc. And for a lot of Jewish students, at least, I know many of them went to those classes and said that they signed up for this. They knew this was coming and they want to hear these opinions. A lot of other faculty members have kind of taken on the role of bringing in pro-Palestinian education into their classroom, or integrating it, one lesson, relating the material to that, moving classes to an encampment or canceling classes for a protest. And that left a lot of Jewish students that I interviewed feeling uncomfortable. I know.
So like a professor would say, we're going to meet at the encampment today. And if you didn't want to be part of the encampment, you were like kind of screwed in terms of going to class?
Unclear. I haven't interviewed any students who had that exact situation. It was also Passover, so some of them weren't there. But essentially, you're stuck or in this like difficult situation. Professors who let out their classes early so students could go protest. And these aren't like Middle Eastern classes. English seminars, feminist, intersectional feminism, or TAs who are also students who devote a session to the conflict and the war. And so I think that led to a lot of hostility toward faculty. I also know in Columbia, the 1968 protests are often talked about like and praised on student activism and standing up for what you believe in, anti-war protests. And that what a lot of that faculty spoke about that a lot and have over the years. That's not new to this year. So I guess claims of incitement could have come from that.
A little bit of a romantic feeling about the whole thing.
Yeah,
I
something
want to
like
go to another question from the audience. A member named John Treese. Thank you again for your question and your support. John says, the encampments clearly don't allow for thoughtful back and forth debate or factual education. Have colleges, however, provided venues that do offer that opportunity? I think probably Arno knows some about that, and then maybe Rebecca or Lauren wants to jump in after that.
Yeah, so some schools certainly have tried. I mean, Elon University, which is a small liberal arts college in North Carolina that has grown to have quite a large Jewish population in recent years, had tables set up in their dining hall where faculty or staff were sort of facilitating conversations about the Middle East. And they actually had, I haven't had a chance to write about this, but a very interesting incident happened there where they brought, they also convened a like special committee to bring in speakers about the conflict, and they brought in the director of Al-Haq, which is a Palestinian human rights organization. And I guess the director kind of went off script, and people thought he kind of went on a political rant, and a number of Jewish students were very upset about that. And the school actually, which was like the first instance where I've heard of this really happening, there have been lots of controversial speakers on campus, but I guess the climate was such and the administration was invested such that he had dinner with 5 or 6 Jewish students who had been some of the most upset about his comments, like later that evening on campus. And I think they felt much better after talking with him. I don't think they agreed, but they felt much better. Duke has also convened a similar thing of a faculty committee to bring in speakers, and I think try to intentionally facilitate those discussions. And it's interesting because I've talked with, my story about Duke, which I did write about, was that the pro-Israel students there were very, had been very aggressive and were sort of dominating the campus discourse. And some of the students who were doing that, and again, it was very intense stuff that I hadn't seen elsewhere. Like they were sort of screaming in one instance, the Shema prayer at counter protesters. And some of the people who were involved in those protests told me oh yeah, I went to hear from a doctor who was in Gaza about doing surgery on, people who had been hit by Israeli bombs. It was really interesting. So I think that those venues do exist. I'm not sure that they actually take away from, people seem to somehow be able to say, oh yeah, I can do this totally civil thing, and then tomorrow I'm going to go to the protest and scream at my opponent. So yeah, but the schools are trying, some of them.
I mean, it's college. I'm realizing that we are close to out of time. So I want to pivot to what's coming next, right? So most places, classes have ended, commencements have either been disrupted or gone off and not been disrupted. I know we had a couple of new encampments coming up the last couple of days, and I think disappearing quickly too. But I wonder what each of you thinks is going to happen. Sort of the summer is a natural break for this movement. What do we think is going to happen this summer? What do we think is going to happen to this movement in the fall? I mean, obviously it depends somewhat what happens in the war itself, but I'd love, without being too predictive, we try to avoid predicting, any insights or thoughts about and kind of what stories are we looking for in terms of where the storyline is going?
I can share some thoughts. So I think there's a sense, and I understand where it comes from often, that these protesters just hate Israel, and it's sort of irrelevant to anything that Israel is actually doing, right? They just don't think that Israel should exist. And I think that's true for the hardcore organizers that are at the very center of this movement. But the protests have drawn in a lot more people who, as Lauren said, are really just looking at their phones, seeing that Israel is killing civilians in Gaza, thinking to themselves, that's really bad. And I have friends who are at this protest movement. Let me go join the movement. And so I think that if the war ends, the protest movement will dissipate. The hardcore people may not want it to dissipate, but you need a bunch of casual people for whom this is not their life. This is not their main goal. These protests are not just the members of Students for Justice in Palestine. There are hundreds of other students on campus who have been engaged here. And so if the conflict ends, which depends on the week, how optimistic I am that it will. Now it seems like we're talking about an invasion of southern Lebanon or something. But I'm hoping that over the next 3 months, of course, that we see a good resolution to the conflict that, you know, that will take a lot of the energy away from campus. We saw this with the 2021 conflict, which was much more limited in scope, but there was a flare up. There was stuff on campus. It was mostly remote because of COVID. But then by the time the fall semester started, folks had moved on to other things. So I think this has activated a bunch of people and means that if in 2 years there's another war, a lot of people are going to like immediately jump back into it. But my sense is if the war ends, the protests will lose their fuel.
I actually don't 100% agree. I think I agree with you that the war is obviously very relevant to the movement, but at the same time, we saw first at Columbia and then at a lot of other schools, and you kind of said in the beginning, campus itself, like there's a feeling that the administration and the faculty are there to protect you. And when the police came, I think a lot of the bridges between students and administration, and then students and faculty governance and all of these questions internally came up. And once the NYPD specifically comments police presence, that brings about questions of Black Lives Matter and police brutality. And so that kind of joined into the pro-Palestinian movement. So I definitely agree with you that the war is contingent, but I think the universities have a lot of trust to rebuild, and a lot has been broken this year. And I think we're going to see that rebuild.
Yeah, I'm realizing that we're basically out of time, and I'm gonna want to wrap up real quickly, but we probably, I mean, I think what's interesting is this movement obviously became an umbrella movement for a lot of other causes, and those causes may persist regardless of Israel-Palestine. And there is now just anger at the university itself, right? So that may be coming to fruition in the fall too. I want to thank Arno, Rebecca, and Lauren for your coverage, for your insights and smarts. And I'm going to invite, and I want to thank again all of our members for joining us. I'm going to invite to the stage Lisa Lepson, our development chair and my partner in planning these events. And over to you, Lisa.
Oh, I just wanted to say thank you, especially to Jodi and her team, to Lauren and Arno and Rebecca for joining us. It's really a privilege and an honor for us at the Forward to have them on staff, to have these thoughtful, nuanced discussions. And as Jodi said at the beginning, their work is made possible by your support, and we so appreciate each and every one of you who joined us. It was great to see a lot of familiar names and unfamiliar names on the list of attendees. And we hope that you will sign up for Arno's newsletter, that you are sharing the recording of this as a basis of conversation, sharing our newsletters, and helping us to broaden our reach and extend our Forward family. And we just really appreciate you joining us and being a part of that Forward family. So thank you and have a great evening. Thanks again.